I've always had a fascination with the unknown, the kind of curiosity that gnaws at you until you have no choice but to satisfy it. My friends, Matt, Lisa, and I have been avid hikers since our college days, drawn to the wildest, most remote places we could find. This time, though, it was different. We weren't just looking for a challenge. We were chasing a legend. Whispering Pines is a place that locals prefer not to talk about. It's a dense stretch of wilderness deep in the Appalachian Mountains, notorious for its eerie stillness and the strange disappearances that have occurred over the years. No one has ever come out and said it's haunted, but the stories that circulate are enough to keep most people away. Tales of hikers vanishing without a trace, odd lights flickering between the trees, and most unsettling, the whispers that people claim to hear when they're alone at night. My friends and I had heard these stories for years, and as much as they freaked us out, they also intrigued us. So, when Matt suggested we check out Whispering Pines for our next hiking trip, I was all in. Lisa, ever the skeptic, agreed more out of loyalty to the group than anything else, but even she couldn't hide the nervous excitement in her voice. We set off on a crisp Friday morning, leaving behind the small town of Stillwater at dawn. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange as the first light of day broke through the mist. The drive was uneventful, the three of us chatting and laughing, though there was an underlying tension none of us wanted to acknowledge. After about an hour on the road, the landscape began to change. The trees grew taller, the roads narrower, and the signs of civilization started to fade away. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was high in the sky, but the woods around us seemed to swallow the light, casting long shadows that made it feel much later than it was. We shouldered our packs and set off down the trail, the ground crunching beneath our boots. The air was cool, with the kind of dampness that clings to your skin. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional creak of old trees swaying in the breeze. After a couple of hours of hiking, we reached a small clearing, perfect for setting up camp. It was a flat patch of earth surrounded by tall pines, their branches thick enough to block out most of the sky. The light that did filter through was dim and muted, casting everything in shades of gray. We set up our tents in a semicircle around a fire pit Matt started to build. The process was routine, but the silence weighed heavy on us. Even Lisa, who usually kept the conversation going, seemed subdued. After camp was set, we decided to explore the area a bit before dark. We stuck close together, the unease from the stories starting to creep into our minds. The deeper we went into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the lack of sound. It was as if the forest itself was watching us, holding its breath, waiting. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped sharply. We huddled around the fire, its flickering flames offering a small comfort in the growing darkness. We tried to shake off the unease by telling stories, but every tale seemed to circle back to Whispering Pines. The mood was somber, our usual banter replaced by whispered conversations and nervous glances into the shadows beyond the firelight. We all felt it, that we weren't alone. It was Lisa who first mentioned hearing something, a soft rustling in the distance. We all stopped talking, straining our ears, but the sound had faded. Probably just an animal, Matt said, though he didn't sound convinced. I nodded, trying to suppress the chill that ran down my spine. We tried to brush it off, but there was no denying that something was out there. We could feel it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The forest was too quiet, the darkness too complete. The usual sounds of nightlife in the woods were absent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was as if everything had been swallowed by the blackness. I lay in my tent, listening, every muscle tensed, every sense on high alert. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but it had a cadence, a rhythm that didn't belong in nature. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, threading through the silence like a dark melody. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering was coming from the woods, just beyond the reach of our campfire. I strained to make out the words, but they were too soft, too distant. But there was something about them, an urgency, a warning. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and stepped out into the cold night. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dull orange glow over the campsite. Matt and Lisa were still asleep, their tents closed, oblivious to the creeping terror outside. I stood there, frozen, listening. The whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't just random sounds. They were voices, multiple voices, overlapping, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It was like they were calling out to me, drawing me in. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness. The whispers seemed to move, circling the camp, growing more insistent. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something was about to happen, something terrible. I wanted to wake Matt and Lisa, but a part of me was too afraid to move, afraid that whatever was out there would see me, would know that I was listening. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I stood there, my flashlight shaking in my hand, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the stories had just gotten to me. But then I saw it, a flicker of movement between the trees. I turned the flashlight toward it, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of something. It was tall, much taller than any person, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin, like the branches of a dead tree. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were the worst part. They were large, black, and glistened like wet stones in the light. They locked onto me, and in that moment, I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated fear wash over me. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, the flashlight slipping from my hand. The thing stepped forward, its movements unnatural, jerky, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. The whispers started again, louder this time, more frantic. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were cries, desperate, pleading cries. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, trapped in those dark, soulless eyes. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The whispers faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it was deafening. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling, staring into the darkness where it had been. Eventually, I managed to crawl back to my tent, my body numb, my mind reeling. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the dawn. When morning finally came, I told Matt and Lisa what had happened. They listened, their faces pale, but I could tell they didn't fully believe me. We packed up and left Whispering Pines that day, cutting our trip short. None of us talked much on the way back. The weight of what had happened, or what we thought had happened, hanging over us like a dark cloud. It's been months since that night, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed us out of those woods. At night, when the wind howls through the trees outside my window, I sometimes hear it again. The whispers, they're faint, just on the edge of hearing, but they're there. I don't know what they're saying, and I don't want to know. All I know is that something is out there, in the dark, waiting, and it hasn't forgotten me. It had always been a dream of mine to visit Loch Ness, the legendary home of the elusive creature known as Nessie. Ever since I was a child, my grandmother would tell me stories about the loch and its mysterious inhabitant, weaving tales of shadowy shapes gliding beneath the water's surface. As I grew older, those stories stayed with me, sparking a curiosity that only intensified over the years. So, when my partner, Ellie, suggested a trip to Scotland to celebrate our 5th anniversary, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. Ellie was more of a skeptic, someone who believed in hard facts and evidence, but she knew how much the idea of seeing Loch Ness meant to me. With a grin and a shrug, she agreed, and a few weeks later, we were on a plane bound for Inverness. The drive to the loch was breathtaking, the landscape a tapestry of rolling hills, dense forests, and ancient ruins. The weather was typically Scottish, gray skies, a light drizzle, and a chill in the air that seemed to seep into your bones. But none of that dampened my excitement. As we approached the loch, its vast expanse of dark water stretching out before us, I felt a strange mixture of awe and apprehension. The loch was even more massive than I had imagined, its surface still and foreboding, as if it held secrets that it had guarded for centuries. We checked into a small bed and breakfast on the outskirts of Drumnadracheat, a quaint village perched on the western shore of the loch. The owner, a friendly older man named Angus, welcomed us with a warm smile and a steaming pot of tea. He was full of stories about the loch, most of them passed down through generations, and though Ellie listened politely, I could see the skepticism in her eyes. Angus noticed too, and with a knowing wink, he told us to be careful if we ventured out onto the water. That evening, after a hearty dinner of haggis and neeps, Ellie and I decided to take a walk along the loch's edge. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange and pink glow over the water. The air was cool and crisp, and the loch was eerily quiet, save for the occasional splash of a fish or the call of a distant bird. We walked in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. For me, it was a moment of reverence. For Ellie, perhaps a moment of reflection. As we rounded a bend in the shoreline, we came across a small, weathered dock jutting out into the loch. A single old rowboat was tied to it, bobbing gently in the water. The sight of it stirred something in me, a desire to get closer to the water, to see if there was any truth to the legends. I suggested we take the boat out for a short ride, just as the sun was setting. Ellie hesitated, looking out over the darkening water, but eventually, she agreed. We climbed into the boat, and I untied the rope, pushing us away from the dock. The water was calm, almost unnaturally so, and the only sound was the soft splash of the oars as I rowed us farther from shore. The loch seemed to stretch on forever, its depths a murky, impenetrable black. As the light continued to fade, a thick mist began to rise from the water, swirling around us like a living thing. It felt as though The lock itself was enveloping us, drawing us into its embrace. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Ellie asked, her voice tinged with unease. She was gripping the sides of the boat, her knuckles white. "Just a little farther," I replied, trying to sound reassuring. "I just want to see if we can spot anything." But as the mist thickened, I began to feel a creeping sense of dread. The loch was vast, much larger than I had anticipated, and out there in the middle of it, with nothing but water and mist in every direction, I felt completely isolated. The realization that we were alone, miles from anyone who could help us, sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, Ellie stiffened, her eyes wide as she stared at the water. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I followed her gaze, scanning the water's surface, but I saw nothing, just the ripples caused by the boat and the ever-present mist. "What was it?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "Something big. It was just under the surface." I stopped rowing, letting the boat drift. We sat in silence, both of us straining to see through the mist. The loch was deathly quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something is watching you, waiting for the right moment to strike. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the water, the stories of Nessie suddenly feeling all too real. And then we heard it, a low rumbling sound, like the groan of something ancient, something massive moving deep below us. The boat rocked slightly, as if something had brushed against it from underneath. Ellie and I both froze, too terrified to speak. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing, but there was no explanation that made sense. The water around us began to ripple, the calm surface breaking into waves that seemed to radiate out from a point just a few yards away. The rumbling grew louder, more insistent, and I felt the boat lurch as something enormous moved beneath us. I could see the shape of it now, a dark shadow just below the surface, its size impossible to comprehend. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, circling us, toying with us. Ellie clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to get out of here," she hissed, her voice barely controlled panic. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed the oars and started rowing, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But no matter how hard I rowed, it felt like we were barely moving. The mist had closed in around us, thick and oppressive, and I had lost all sense of direction. The loch seemed to stretch on forever, an endless expanse of water with no end in sight. And then, without warning, the boat was lifted out of the water as if by a massive wave. We were thrown to the side, Ellie screaming as she clung to the edge. The boat tipped dangerously, water sloshing over the sides, and I struggled to keep us upright. I looked down, and through the mist, I saw it, an enormous, serpentine neck rising from the water, its dark, glistening skin covered in patches of moss and algae. The head was partially obscured by the mist, but I could see its eyes, large, black, and filled with an intelligence that was as terrifying as it was alien. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound that echoed across the loch and vibrated through my bones. It was a sound of rage, of warning, and I knew in that moment that we had made a grave mistake. We had ventured into its domain, and it was not pleased. The boat was tossed again, and this time we were both thrown into the water. The cold was shocking, stealing the breath from my lungs as I flailed, trying to stay afloat. The water was thick, almost oily, and it clung to me like a living thing, pulling me down. I kicked frantically, my eyes searching for Ellie, but the mist was too thick, the water too dark. I could hear her screaming somewhere nearby, but her voice was lost in the chaos. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The water went still, the mist began to lift, and the loch returned to its unnerving calm. I found myself floating on my back, gasping for air, my heart racing. The boat was gone, and so was Ellie. I screamed her name, my voice hoarse and raw, but there was no response. The loch had swallowed her whole. For hours, I drifted in the water, too exhausted to move, too terrified to do anything but wait. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the mist, I saw the shore in the distance. With the last of my strength, I swam toward it, collapsing on the rocky beach as soon as I reached it. I lay there, shivering and broken, staring out at the loch, knowing that I had seen something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Ellie was never found. The official report said she drowned, that we were victims of a boating accident. But I know the truth. I saw it with my own eyes, felt its presence in the water. The loch is alive, and something ancient and terrible lurks beneath its surface, and it's still out there, waiting. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, the kind of deep, untouched forests where the world feels ancient and undisturbed. It's where I feel most alive, away from the noise of modern life, surrounded by the whisper of trees and the calls of unseen creatures. For years, I've been exploring the Pacific Northwest, a region steeped in mystery and dense with untamed wilderness. But this trip was different. This time, I wasn't just looking for solitude. I was searching for something that had haunted my dreams since childhood. Bigfoot. My fascination with the creature began when I was a kid. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the wild man of the woods, a towering, ape-like figure that lurked in the shadows of the forests, watching, waiting. He swore he'd seen it once, deep in the Cascade Mountains. Though he never told me exactly where, those stories stayed with me, growing into an obsession that led me to spend years reading every book, every article, watching every grainy video that purported to show the elusive creature. Now, in my early 30s, I finally had the chance to go on a proper expedition. My friend Mike, a fellow outdoorsman and skeptic, had agreed to come along. He didn't believe in Bigfoot. He was the kind of guy who needed solid proof for everything. But he was up for the adventure, and he knew these woods as well as anyone. We planned a week-long trek deep into the Olympic National Forest, a place known for its thick, towering trees, its isolation, and the occasional report of strange sightings. We set out in late October, the air crisp and cool, the leaves just beginning to turn. The trailhead was miles from the nearest town, and as we shouldered our packs and started hiking, the world of asphalt and noise quickly faded away. The forest here was dense, the trees so tall and thick that they blocked out much of the sunlight. The ground was soft underfoot, a mix of fallen leaves, pine needles, and rich, dark soil. It was the kind of place that felt ancient, primordial. The first few days were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Mike teased me about it, calling it Bigfoot fever, but there was something in the air, a sense of anticipation that hung over the forest like a thick fog. At night, as we sat around our small campfire, the sounds of the forest would grow louder. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. I found myself constantly scanning the darkness, searching for movement, listening for anything out of the ordinary. On the fourth day, we decided to push deeper into the forest, off the main trails, and into an area that was rarely explored. It was remote, wild, the kind of place where few people ever ventured. We spent most of the day bushwhacking through thick undergrowth, our progress slow but steady. By late afternoon, we found a small clearing beside a creek, an ideal spot to set up camp. As we unpacked our gear and set up our tents, I noticed something strange. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of birds and insects, had gone unnervingly quiet. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Mike noticed it too, pausing in the middle of setting up his tent to look around, a frown creasing his forehead. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was something about the silence that was deeply unsettling, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We finished setting up camp quickly, neither of us wanting to be caught off guard if something, anything, was out there. That night, the quiet continued. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows that danced on the trees, but the usual sounds of the forest were absent. Mike and I sat close to the fire, our conversation stilted and tense. He tried to brush it off, attributing the silence to the lateness of the season, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Around midnight, just as we were considering turning in, we heard it, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the trees. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I had ever heard before. My blood ran cold as the sound reverberated in my chest, primal and terrifying. Mike and I froze, our eyes locked in the firelight, both of us too shocked to move. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could answer, we heard it again, closer this time. It was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, the crunch of something massive moving through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the darkness, the beam cutting through the inky blackness. At first we saw nothing, just the trees, their bark rough and glistening with moisture. But then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. It was huge, a dark shape that seemed to melt into the shadows. I felt a surge of panic as I realized how close it was, how silently it had approached. Mike grabbed his hunting rifle, his hands trembling as he raised it, eyes scanning the darkness. The growl came again, this time so close that I could feel the vibration in my bones. My hand tightened around the flashlight, the beam shaking as I tried to keep it steady. And then we saw it. It stepped into the edge of the clearing, just barely within the circle of light. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair that glistened in the firelight. Its eyes glowed a deep, unnatural red, and they locked onto us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The creature's face was both human and animal, with a broad, flat nose, a heavy brow, and a mouth that was slightly open, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The world narrowed to just the 3 of us, the fire, the creature, and the 2 terrified men sitting by it. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what I was seeing, but it was too surreal, too nightmarish. It couldn't be real. And yet, there it was, standing just a few yards away, watching us with an intelligence that was far too keen for comfort. Mike slowly raised his rifle, But before he could aim, the creature let out a deafening roar. It was a sound of pure rage, a deep, bone-rattling howl that shook the ground beneath us. The force of it knocked Mike backward, his rifle slipping from his grasp as he fell. I scrambled to help him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The creature took a step closer, its massive footfalls shaking the earth. It was close enough now that I could see the steam rising from its body in the cold night air, the powerful muscles rippling beneath its fur. Its eyes never left us, those glowing red orbs filled with a malevolent intelligence. In a blind panic, I grabbed a burning log from the fire and hurled it at the creature. The log struck its chest, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The creature recoiled, letting out another roar, this one filled with more anger than before. It swatted the log aside as if it were nothing, but it didn't advance further. Instead, it stood there, watching us, the firelight reflecting off its massive frame. Mike, still on the ground, managed to grab his rifle again. He fumbled with it, trying to steady his shaking hands. But before he could take aim, the creature let out a final, piercing shriek and turned, disappearing into the darkness with terrifying speed. We heard the crashing of branches, the snapping of trees, and then silence. For what felt like an eternity, we sat there, too shocked to move, listening to the silence that had once again enveloped the forest. It was as if the encounter had been a fevered hallucination, but the lingering smell of burnt wood and the deep impressions in the ground where the creature had stood were proof that it had been all too real. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't speak much either. We just sat by the dying fire, rifles in hand, watching the darkness, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees. When morning finally came, we packed up our camp in silence, our movements mechanical and hurried. We didn't talk about what we had seen. There was no need to. The fear in our eyes said everything. We left the forest that day, cutting our trip short, and neither of us ever spoke of the encounter again. Mike, the skeptic, never returned to the woods, and I found myself avoiding them as well. The wilderness, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a place of nightmares. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm alone in the dark. The memory of those glowing red eyes haunting my thoughts. I know what I saw was real, and I know that somewhere out there, in the vast, untamed wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, something is watching, waiting, and I can only hope that I never cross its path again. I've always been drawn to the woods. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, I spent most of my childhood exploring the dense forests that surrounded our community. The towering evergreens and the soft, moss-covered ground felt like home to me. But there was one part of the forest I had never dared to enter. Everyone in town called it the Forest of Whispers, and for good reason. The Forest of Whispers lay on the edge of our town, separated by an old, rusted fence that had been there longer than anyone could remember. The few who had crossed that boundary came back with wild stories of hearing voices when no one was around, strange lights flickering between the trees, and an eerie feeling of being watched. Naturally, this made it all the more intriguing to me. One autumn afternoon, when the days were growing shorter and the crisp scent of fallen leaves filled the air, I decided it was time to see what was beyond that fence. Armed with nothing but my flashlight and a sense of adventure, I set off on my bike, pedaling down the familiar dirt path that wound through the outskirts of town. The sun was setting behind me, casting long shadows on the trail, and the further I went, the quieter everything became. By the time I reached the fence, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and a thick fog had started to roll in, weaving through the trees like a ghostly serpent. I lifted my bike over the fence and climbed over myself, landing softly on the other side. The air was colder here, and a strange stillness hung over the place, like the forest was holding its breath. I turned on my flashlight, and the beam cut through the mist, illuminating the path ahead. The trees here were different, older, gnarled, and twisted, with branches that reached out like skeletal fingers. As I walked deeper into the woods, I started to understand why people called it the Forest of Whispers. The wind moved through the trees in a strange way, creating a soft, almost melodic murmur. It was unsettling, but I pressed on. After about an hour of walking, I came upon a small clearing. In the center was an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof caved in and windows shattered. It looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. I approached cautiously, my flashlight sweeping over the rotting wood and broken glass. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, a soft, incomprehensible chorus that seemed to come from all around me. I spun in a circle, shining my light into the darkness, but saw nothing. My rational mind told me it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Then, I heard a different sound, a low, guttural growl coming from inside the cabin. I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The growl came again, louder this time, and I could hear something moving inside. The creak of old floorboards under heavy footsteps. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence. And then the whispering returned, more urgent now, like a warning. I backed away from the cabin, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The fog had thickened, closing in around me, and I could barely see the trees anymore. It was as if the forest itself was trapping me, holding me in place. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the cabin. At first, I thought it was a person, but as it stepped into the light, I realized it was something else entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, gangly limbs, and a head that was too large for its emaciated body. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were just black, empty pits. It stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel them pressing in on me, filling my mind with 1,000 voices. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight in the process. It hit the ground and flickered out, plunging me into darkness. I could hear it moving toward me, its footsteps slow and deliberate. I scrambled to pick up my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. When I finally managed to turn it back on, the figure was right in front of me. I screamed and swung the flashlight at it, but it passed right through, like it was made of smoke. The creature let out a bone-chilling wail, and I felt a cold hand close around my throat, lifting me off the ground. I kicked and thrashed, but it was no use. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could see were those empty black eyes staring into mine, pulling me into an abyss. Just when I thought I was going to pass out, I heard a loud crack, like a tree branch snapping, and the creature released me. I fell to the ground, gasping for air, and looked up to see a man standing there, holding a broken piece of wood. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. "Get up," he said, in a gruff voice, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. "We need to get out of here now." I didn't argue. We ran through the fog, the whispers still echoing in my ears. But they were fading now, growing distant. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the creature's presence behind us, chasing us, but it never caught up. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the fence. The man helped me over, and I collapsed on the other side, panting and shaking. He climbed over after me, and we both just sat there for a moment, catching our breath. Who are you?" I finally managed to ask. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Just someone who knows better than to go into those woods alone," he said. "You should do the same." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I never saw him again. I never went back to the Forest of Whispers. I don't know what that thing was, or why it let me go, but I still hear the whispers sometimes, in my dreams. They're always the same, a soft, mournful chorus that fills me with a sense of dread. And I know, deep down, that the forest is still out there, waiting